Good morning. Today I'm going to first make sure my microphone is working properly, and seems to be. So today I'm reading from the Red Book by C.G. Jung, Reader's Edition, and today I'm continuing on with Liber Secundus, which is the second major book in the Red Book. Hello, Nicholas, welcome. And so the section that I am reading is, let me just double check, is chapter 7 of Liber Secundus, beginning on page 268 of the Reader's Edition, The Remains of Earlier Temples. The remains of earlier temples. Yet another new adventure occurred. Wide meadows spread out before me, a carpet of flowers, soft hills, a fresh green wood in the distance. I come across two strange journeymen, probably two completely accidental companions, an old monk and a tall, gangly, thin man with a childish gait and discolored red clothes. As they draw near, I recognize the tall one as the Red Rider. How he has changed. He has grown old. His red hair has become gray. His fiery red clothes are worn out, shabby, poor. And the other? He has a paunch and appears not to have fallen on bad times, but his face seems familiar. By all the gods, it is Ammonius. What changes, and where are these utterly different people coming from? I approach them and bid them good day. Both look at me frightened and make the sign of the cross. Their horror prompts me to look down at myself. I am fully covered in green leaves, which spring from my body. I greet them a second time, laughing. Ammonius exclaimed, horrified, Apage, Satanas! Begone, Satan! The red one, damned pagan riffraff. But my dear friends, what's wrong with you? I'm the Hyperborean stranger who visited you, O Ammonius, in the desert, and I'm the watchman whom you, red one, once visited. Ammonius, I recognize you, you supreme devil. My downfall began with you. The red one looks at him reproachfully and gives him a poke in the ribs. The monk sheepishly stops. The red one turns haughtily toward me. Red one. Already at that time, I couldn't help thinking that you lacked a noble disposition, notwithstanding your hypocritical seriousness, your damned Christian play act. At this moment, Ammonius pokes him in the ribs, and the red one falls into an embarrassed silence, and thus both stand before me, sheepish and ridiculous, and yet pitiable. Where from, man of God? What outrageous fate has led you here, let alone in the company of the red one? Ammonius, I would prefer not to tell you, but it does not appear to be a dispensation of God that one can escape. So know then that you, evil spirit, have done me a terrible deed. You seduced me with your accursed curiosity, desirously stretching my hand after the divine mysteries. Once you made me conscious at that time that I really knew nothing about them. Your remark that I probably needed the closeness of men to arrive at the higher mysteries stunned me like infernal poison. Soon thereafter, I called the brothers of the valley together and announced to them that a messenger of God had appeared to me. So terribly had you blinded me and commanded me to form a monastery with the brothers. When Brother Philetus raised an objection, I refuted him with reference to the passage in the Holy Scriptures, where it is said that it is not good for a man to be alone. So we founded the monastery near the Nile, from where we could see the passing ships. We cultivated fat fields, and there was so much to do that the Holy Scriptures fell into oblivion. We became voluptuous, and one day I was filled with such terrible longing to see Alexandria again. I talked myself into believing that I wanted to visit the bishop there. But first I was intoxicated so much by life on the ship, and then by the milling crowds on the streets of Alexandria, that I became completely lost. As in a dream, I climbed onto a large ship bound for Italy. I felt an insatiable greed to see the world. I drank wine and saw that women were beautiful. I wallowed in pleasure and wholly turned into an animal. When I climbed ashore in Naples, the Red One stood there, and I knew that I had fallen into the hands of evil. Red One: be silent, old fool. If I had not been present, you would have become an outright pig. When you saw me, you finally pulled yourself together, cursed the drinking and the women, and returned to the monastery. Now hear my story, damned hobgoblin. I too fell into your snare, and your pagan arts also enticed me. After the conversation at that time, where you caught me in the foxtrap with your remark about dancing, I became serious, so serious that I went into the monastery, prayed, fasted, and converted myself. In blindness, I wanted to reform the church liturgy, and with the bishop's approval, I introduced dancing. I became abbot, and as such alone had the sole right to dance before the altar, like David before the Ark of the Covenant. But little by little, the brothers also began to dance. Indeed, even the congregation of the faithful, and finally the whole city danced. It was terrible. I fled into solitude and danced all day until I dropped. But in the morning, the hellish dance began again. I sought to escape from myself and strayed and wandered around at night. In the daytime, I kept myself secluded and danced alone in the forests and deserted mountains. And thus, gradually, I came to Italy. Down there in the south, I no longer felt as I had felt in the north. I could mingle with the crowds. Only in Naples did I somewhat find my way again, and there I also found this ragged man of God. His appearance gave me strength. Through him I could regain my health. You've heard how he took heart from me, too, and found his way again. Ammonius: I must confess I did not fare so badly with the Red One. He's a toned down type of devil. He's a toned down. Sorry. I'll read that again. Okay. Ammonius: I must confess I did not fare so badly with the Red One. He's a toned down type of devil. Red One: I must add that the monk is hardly the fanatical type, although I've developed a deep aversion against the whole Christian religion since my experience in the monastery. Dear friends, it does my heart good to see you enjoying yourselves together. Both. We are not pleased, mocker and adversary. Clear off, you robber, pagan. But why are you traveling together if you're not enjoying each other's company and friendship? Ammonius: what can be done? Even the devil is necessary, since otherwise one has nothing that commands a sense of respect with people. Red One: well, I need to come to an arrangement with the clergy, or else I will lose my clientele. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to read that again. Yes, I think okay, you're going to hear about it in the next couple of days because there's some stuff coming up that's very appropriate for our time of life, our current affairs. Red one. Well, I need to come to an arrangement with the clergy, or else I will lose my clientele. I, therefore, the necessities of life have brought you together. So let's make peace and be friends. Both. We can never be friends. I, oh, I see. The system is at fault. You probably want to die out first. Now let me pass, you old ghosts. When I had seen death and all the terrible solemnity that is gathered around it, and had become ice and night myself, an angry life and an impulse rose up in me. My thirst for the rushing water of the deepest knowledge began to clink with wine glasses. From afar, I heard drunken laughter, laughing women and street noise. Dance music, stamping and cheering poured forth from all over, and instead of the rose-scented south wind, the reek of the human animal streamed over me. Luscious lewd horrors giggled and rustled along the walls. Wine fumes, wine fumes, and kitchen steam, and the foolish cackling of the human crowd drew near in a cloud. And the foolish cackling of the human crowd drew near me in a cloud. Hot, sticky, tender hands reached out for me, and I was swaddled in the covers of a sickbed. I was born into life from below, and I grew up as heroes do, in hours rather than years. And after I had grown up, I found myself in the middle land and saw that it was spring. But I was no longer the man I had been, for a strange being grew through me. This was a laughing being of the forest, a leaf-green demon, a forest goblin and prankster, who lived alone in the forest and was itself a greening tree being, who loved nothing but greening and growing, who was neither disposed nor indisposed toward men, full of mood and chance, obeying an invisible law, and greening and wilting with the trees, neither beautiful nor ugly, neither good nor bad, merely living primordially old and yet completely young, naked, and yet naturally clothed, not man but nature, frightened, laughable, powerful, childish, weak, deceiving and deceived, utterly inconstant and superficial, and yet reaching deep down to the kernel of the world. I had absorbed the life of both of my friends. A green tree grew from the ruins of the temple. They had not withstood life, but seduced by life had become their own monkey business. They had got caught in the muck, and so they called the living a devil and a traitor. Because both of them believed in themselves and in their own God, because both of them believed in themselves and their own goodness, each in his own way, they ultimately became mired in the natural and conclusive burial ground of all outlived ideas. The most beautiful and the best, like the ugliest and the worst, end up someday in the most laughable place in the world, surrounded by fancy dress and led by fools, and go horror-struck to the pit of filth. After cursing comes laughter, so that the soul is saved from the dead. Ideals are, according to their essence, desired and pondered. They exist to this extent, but only to this extent. Yet their effective being cannot be denied. He who believes he is really living his ideals, or believes he can live them, suffers from delusions of grandeur. and behaves like a lunatic in that he stages himself as an ideal, but the hero has fallen. Ideals are mortal. So one should prepare oneself for the end, and at the same time, it probably costs you your neck. For do you not see that it was you who gave meaning, value, and effective force to your ideals? If you have become a sacrifice to the ideal, then the ideal cracks open, plays carnival with you, and goes to hell on Ash Wednesday. The ideal is also a tool that one can put aside anytime, a torch on dark paths. But whoever runs around with a torch by day is a fool. How much my ideals have come down, and how freshly my tree greens. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not commenting on the chat at the moment, as this is a reading. I'm reading from the Red Book by C.G. Jung, Reader's Edition. I'm on page 273 of the Reader's Edition, and this is chapter 7 of Liber Secundus, The Remains of Earlier Temples. So I'm going to continue the reading, then I will come back to your chats at the end. Page 273. When I turned green, they stood there, the sad remains of earlier temples and rose gardens, and I recognized with a shudder their inner affinity. It seemed to me that they had established an indecent alliance. But I understood that this alliance had already existed for a long time. At a time when I still claimed that my sanctuaries were of crystal purity, and when I compared my friends to the perfume of the roses of Persia, both of them formed an alliance of mutual silence. They seemed to scatter, but secretly they worked together. The solitary silence of the temple lured me far away from men, to the supernatural mysteries in which I lost myself, to the point of surfeit. And while I struggled with God, the devil prepared himself for my reception and tore me just as far to his side. There too I found no boundaries other than surfeit and disgust. I did not live, but was driven. I was a slave to my ideals. And thus they stood there, the ruins, quarreling with one another and unable to reconcile themselves to their common misery. Within myself, I had become one as a natural being. But I was a hobgoblin who frightened the solitary wanderer and who avoided the places of men. But I greened and bloomed from within myself. I had still not become a man again, who carried within himself the conflict between a longing for the world and a longing for the spirit. I did not live either of these longings, but I lived myself and was a merrily greening tree in a remote spring forest. And thus I learned to live without the world and spirits. And I was amazed how well I could live like this. But what about men? What about mankind? There they stood, the two deserted bridges that should lead across to mankind. One leads from above to below, and men glide down on it, which pleases them. The other leads from below to above, and mankind groans upward on it. This causes them trouble. We drive our fellow men to trouble and joy. If I myself do not live, but merely climb, it gives others undeserved pleasure. If I simply enjoy myself, it causes others undeserved trouble. If I merely live, I am far removed from men. They no longer see me, and when they see me, they are astonished and shocked. I myself, however, quite simply living, greening, blooming, fading, stand like a tree always in the same spot, and let the suffering and the joy of men pass over me with equanimity. And yet I am a man who cannot excuse himself from the discord. And yet I am a man who cannot excuse himself from the discord of the human heart. But my ideals can also be my dogs, whose yapping and squabbling do not disturb me, but at least then I am a good and a bad dog to men. But at least if I ever edit this, there'll be some good outtakes. But at least then I am a good and a bad dog to men. But I have not yet achieved what should be, namely, that I live and yet am a man. It seems to me nearly impossible to live as a man. As long as you are not conscious of yourself, you can live. But if you become conscious of yourself, you fall from one grave into another. All your rebirths could ultimately make you sick. The Buddha therefore finally gave up on rebirth, for he had had enough of crawling through all human and animal forms. After all the rebirths, you still remain the lion crawling on the earth. Okay, this is in Greek, but I'm going to translate it. The chameleon, a caricature, one prone to changing colors, a crawling, shimmering lizard, but precisely not a lion, whose nature is related to the sun, who draws his power from within himself, who does not crawl around in the protective colors of the environment, and who does not defend himself by going into hiding. I recognize the chameleon and no longer want to crawl on the earth and change colors and be reborn. Instead, I want to exist from my own force, like the sun, which gives light and does not suck light. That belongs to the earth. I recall my solar nature and would like to rush to my rising, but ruins stand in my way. They say, with regard to men, you should be this or that. My chameleon-esque skin shudders. They obtrude upon me and want to color me, but that should no longer be. Neither good nor evil shall be my masters. I push them aside, the laughable survivors, and go on my way again, which leads me to the east. The quarreling powers that for so long stood between me and myself lie behind me. Henceforth, I am completely alone. I can no longer say to you, listen, or you should, or you could, but now I talk only with myself. Now no one else can do anything more for me, nothing whatsoever. I no longer have a duty toward you, and you no longer have duties toward me. Since I vanish and you vanish from me, I no longer hear requests and no longer make requests of you. I no longer fight and reconcile myself with you, but place silence between you and me. Your call dies away in the distance, and you cannot find my footprints, together with the west wind, which comes from the plains of the ocean. I journey across the green countryside. I roam through the forests and bend the young grass. I talk with trees and the forest wildlife, and the stones show me the way. When I thirst and the source does not come to me, I go to the source. When I starve and the bread does not come to me, I seek my bread and take it where I find it. I provide no help and need no help. If at any time necessity confronts me, I do not look around to see whether there is a helper nearby, but I accept the necessity and bend and writhe and struggle. I laugh, I weep, I swear, but I do not look around me. On this way, On this way, no one walks behind me, and I cross no one's path. I am alone, but I fill my solitariness with my life. I am man enough. I am noise, conversation, comfort, and help enough unto myself. And so I wander, to the far east, not that I know anything about what my distant goal might be. I see blue horizons before me. They suffice as a goal. I hurry toward the east and my rising. I will my rising. Okay, so that's the end of the reading. Now I'll go back and catch the footnotes, which are often quite important. So the name of this chapter is The Remains of the Temple. And the footnote reads, the handwritten draft has instead sixth adventure. The corrected draft has instead degenerate ideals. And then before the beginning of this chapter are two footnotes. One says, the mosaic form resembles the mosaics at Ravenna, which Jung visited in 1913 and 1914, and which made a lasting impression on him. And also the footnote reads, January 5, 1914. So Dr. Jung's active imaginations began on December 12th, 1913, after some preliminaries that included some of his prefiguration visions of World War I. Those began on October 17th, 1913. So if you're having prefiguration visions about what can happen in the future, based on our current affairs, you might want to pay attention to them. Okay, then a footnote, when Ammonius exclaims horrified, apage Satanas, and that means begone Satan, a common expression of the Middle Ages. And then Dr. Jung refers to himself as a Hyperborean. The Hyperboreans were a race in Greek mythology who lived in a land of sunshine beyond the north wind, worshiping Apollo. Nietzsche referred on several occasions to the free spirits as Hyperboreans. And the references, the Antichrist, section 1, Twilight of the Idols, the Antichrist. I guess that's a Nietzschean book. Okay, then the next footnote. When Brother Philetus raised an objection, I refuted him with reference to the passage of the Holy Scriptures where it is said that it is not good for a man to be alone. And the footnote reads, a reference to Genesis 2:18. Quote, and the Lord God said, it is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helpmeet for him. There is one reference to Philetus in the Bible, 2 Timothy, or I'm sorry, it's 2 Timothy 2:16-18. Quote, but shun profane and vain babblings, for they will increase unto more ungodliness, and their word will eat as doth the cancer, whom is Hymenaeus and Philetus, who concerning the truth have erred, saying that the resurrection is past already, and overthrow the faith of some. And then there's a later reference where he says, I became abbot, and as such alone had the sole right to dance before the altar, like David before the Ark of the Covenant. And in Chronicles 1:15, David dances before the Ark of the Covenant. Then this. my thirst for the rushing water of the deepest knowledge. And the footnote reads, the corrected draft has the wisdom instead of the deepest knowledge. And let's see then. Okay, then when I turned green, then stood there the sad remains of earlier temples and rose gardens, and I recognized with a shudder their inner affinity. And the footnote reads, the draft and corrected draft I had become a victim of my sanctuaries and beauties, and so I died miserable and depressed. Therefore, death came to me. And then later footnote, I compared my friends to the perfume of the roses of Persia. And the footnote reads, in Persia, the crushed petals of rose were steam distilled to make rose oil, from which perfumes were made. And the text reads, within myself I had become one as a natural being, but I was a hobgoblin who frightened the solitary wanderer and who avoided the places of men. And the footnote reads, in 1926, Jung wrote, the transition from morning to afternoon is a transvaluation of inner values. From this comes the necessity to appreciate the value of the opposite of our former ideals, to recognize the error in former truth, and to feel how much antagonism, even hatred, lay in what had formerly passed for love for us. And that's from an essay entitled The Unconscious in Normal and Sick Psychic Life, Collected Works 7, paragraph 115. And then this, within myself I had become one as a natural being, but I was a hobgoblin. And the footnote reads, the corrected draft has green creature. And then all your rebirths could ultimately make you sick. And he had written, all my rebirths could ultimately make me sick. And this is a reference to the Job archetype, which we've discussed at length. And then so Buddha therefore finally gave up on rebirth, for he had had enough of crawling through all human and animal forms. And the footnote reads, like a chameleon, a passage occurs here in the draft, a paraphrase of which follows. It is our chameleon nature that forces us through these transformations. So long as we are chameleons, we need an annual journey in the bath of rebirth. Therefore, I looked at the outdating of my ideals with horror, since I loved my natural greenness and mistrusted my chameleon skin, which changed colors according to the environment. So you experience 777 rebirths. So you experience 777 rebirths. The Buddha did not need quite so long to see that even rebirths are vain. There was a belief that the soul had to go through 777 reincarnations. And that comes from a book called The New Theosophy, written by Ernest Woods. So that's from the Theosophical Society. Let's see. I recall my solar nature and would like to rush to my rising, but ruins stand in my way. And the footnote reads, the vestige of my ideal. So here he's referring to these vestiges or the remains of earlier temples as his earlier ideals. So now I'll take a look at your comments. Zach Bennett says, Goliath equals Goliath down, that I may walk on thee like a doormat. David trusted God. Yep. Dixon says, hear you loud and clear. Nicholas Chan commented on my evil laughter. Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure it came across as that. Vixen says, Chan was bound to happen. Corey, hi, Skip. Nicholas, obscure and jokes. Corey, I started to read a reading group with 2 workers that wanted to read Liber Novus. While at first I was fond of reading it with them, I found it dangerous for their psyche, since they, including myself, aren't very far into Jung's work. I suggested we start with Man and His Symbols first, since that's where I began. Would you have any suggestion about additional books to read before the Red Book? Well, I'd certainly also recommend Memory Streams Reflections, and also a couple of authors who are Jungian analysts, but have written sort of about archetypes and archetypal matters. And those are Clarissa Pinkola Estes, who wrote Women Who Run with the Wolves, and Jean Shinoda Bolen, who wrote Gods in Every Man and Goddesses in Every Woman. That's 2 books. If you read those, you'll have a fairly good grounding of some of the basics of Jungian thought before you get into the muck in the Red Book, because Dr. Jung is examining his own soul. He's in his own unconscious, which isn't necessarily your unconscious. And so it's very good to have handrails in the form of understanding at least what the archetypes are before you get down into the Red Book, because the Red Book, if you get yourself a copy of the Reader's Edition, you can read the introduction, and that also can give you a bit of a grounding from Sonu Shamdasani, who's the editor and spent 13 years doing this. But anyway, one of my friends and subscribers brought to my attention a talk that Dr. Shamdasani did about the Red Book. I'm not sure what the timing was of Dr. Shamdasani's talk, but it was just posted this month, and you might want to listen to what Shamdasani says, because he says it's a descent into hell. And so I'm not a mental health professional, so I only think it's important to hear this wisdom. So Oleg thanks me, and Terrence Blake says, the natural being a greening life makes one think of Tolkien's Tom Bombadil. Yep, probably. And the solar nature recalls Zarathustra at the beginning of Thus Spake Zarathustra. Also, yes, I laugh, I weep, I swear recalls the hermit in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Terrence says that the title, The Remains of Earlier Temples, recalls the chapter, The Old and New Law Tables of Thus Spake Zarathustra. And so, yes, as Dr. Jung said, the earlier temples were ideals, and the old law tables are the earlier ideals, earlier temples. Yes. Crypto says, hi from France, felt in the Jung rabbit hole, fell fell in the Jung rabbit hole last year. Happy to have found this channel. Great. I'm glad you're here. Okay, so that is today's reading, and I am going to move on. But I will be continuing this process over the next few days. I still have around 180 pages of Liber Secundus to read, and I think I want to complete that. And so Vixen says, rebirths are like peeling the layers of an onion, and only when your hands are empty, you realize that we are not constituted only by some imaginary core. Okay, fair enough. And Terence says, we see that Ammonius and the Red One have been changed by Jung's encounter with them. Yes, this is what is missing in Peter Kingsley's Catafalque, who treats the deep psychic reality as absolute and unchanging. Yes, I agree with you about that. Although I like Kingsley's book very much for reasons of my own, I find Kingsley very pessimistic, and I think that if we understand what Jung was driving at, we can all live fuller lives. And by the way, one of my subscribers also made me aware of the New York Times critique of the Red Book. Let me see if I can find that quickly, which is very good. It's a very good piece, and I probably will read it. Let me just give you that link because you might find it useful. See if I can find it here on my Facebook. Well, she just gave it to me this morning, and it's already, okay, it's called The Holy Grail of the Unconscious, and I'll give you the link to it because it's very powerful and very good commentary. I really liked it. And Gray says, the good and the beautiful stick to the ice of the absolute ideal. Yeah. So, and Terrence asks if I finished my review of Catafalque. No, I have many things to do these days, and I keep not getting to that. And I had tried to read portions of Catafalque as a way to help Peter and Maria get interest in it in the book, but Peter called me up and told me not to read it, so I stopped reading it. And I had fully intended to do a review of it, but I have a resistance because of his resistance to me reading his book. So at some point, I'm going to go back to Maria and suggest that she speak to Peter about this because, what I feel is that all of my readings are helping people get into Jung's work a little bit better, and that they don't detract from people who publish books, because what is perfectly clear is that it's absolutely impossible to listen to one of these readings and understand everything that's happened in the reading. You really need these books. And I think what the readings do is make you realize that you have to get the book and read it carefully, because it's not like a novel. I mean, if I was reading a novel and it's just a cutesy story, that's one thing, but these books, I mean, I found myself, I had one particular sentence today, which I had to read about 5 times to understand it even myself, and that's after I've read the book so many times. Grace says, I'm enjoying Catafalque, but it is not exactly what I hoped for. That's not fair, but it is. And Paolo says, you're extremely helpful. Please keep up the streams and videos. Well, I hope to continue to do that for the foreseeable future. I'm at least setting as an interim goal here to get through the rest of Liber Secundus, and then I will have completed the whole book. I had read Liber Primus about 2 years ago, and Scrutinies maybe about a year ago. And so in the description of this and all the other segments of the Red Book, I've put the playlist with all the links to all the different readings. And so you can find them there and read them. It might interest you to know that part 1, this is part 26 here, or my 26th reading from the Red Book, but part 1 has had over 42,000 hits, and it's the most popular book on my YouTube channel by far. That particular reading, which is the meaning of what is to come, is the most popular reading. And also, I would urge you to read the first essay in the series called Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions. There are 3 volumes of this, but Thomas Arsch wrote the essay that's number 1 in this whole series of 3 volumes. And it is a profound essay. I urge you all to listen to that essay. Terrence says, my review is in several posts on my blog, Agent Swarm. It is impartial, so it contains criticism. And yeah, I mean, I was going to begin my critique, and I think we're talking still about Peter's book. The way I was going to talk about it, because Peter was quite critical of the Jungian analyst community, of which I am somewhat critical, because I regard Dr. Jung's work as important both societally and individually. So Jungian analysts have focused for the last century on individual analysis, which is fair enough. And so one of them, I won't say who, admitted to me that they sort of hid the societal importance of Dr. Jung's work because they didn't want to be attacked by theologians and by psychologists of the Freudian school. And so they just stuck to the knitting of doing individual analysis. And, you know, fair enough. Okay, so they created a rice bowl, a profession that they could make a living at. And that's fair enough, except that the horrible fact is that I believe that these ideas and this knowledge, if it is more widely spread, will move us faster and closer to peace and to humans understanding ourselves better and what we need to do to change and go into the 5th level of consciousness and beyond that. And so so that's why I've been doing my work, because number one, I consider Dr. Jung himself my analyst, my shrink, because by reading his work, I'm working on my own psyche all the time. And that's helped me quite a lot over some really crazy ups and downs in my career. And so it's done that for me. But beyond that, in the process, I've realized that these ideas are really important and we should know them. And, you know, if you're an American and you're watching the impeachment stuff on the cable channels this week, you know, the next 2 or 3 days really relate to that. The material that I'll be reading from the Red Book in the next 2 or 3 days really relate to that. And I'm not going to go into my commentary on that. I may do some in my political psychology channel, which you can find, but I'm not going to do it in this channel. I'm going to try to stick only to what Dr. Jung said and let you folks work it out. But anyway, so Terrence says he's going to, oh, wait a minute, let's see. Paula says, I will watch and rewatch every single video you've got on your channel for years to come. Your work is insanely helpful to many people. Never forget that. I do think that that's true, Paula, because, you know, the honest truth is you have to be in like the 1% or the 5% of intellectual and wealthy people in the country in order to afford a true Jungian analysis. It costs $150 an hour. And I personally could never afford that, really. I did try to start a Jungian analysis with a Jungian a couple of times. And, you know, one of them rejected me because she said she was afraid of me. You know, one of the things about me is that because I've been studying this stuff for 33 years pretty intensely, I actually know a lot of more than a lot of Jungian analysts about Dr. Jung. And I've had a couple of people admit to me that they've never read the Red Book. I go, what? And I'm talking about Jungian analysts who've admitted that they've never read the Red Book. And I go, oh my God. So that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. And so Terrence says, I will put a link to the full review below in the comments. Yes, put it in the comments though, but not in the chat, because I probably will hide the chat when the replay comes out, but it'll be in the comments for this reading, which will be available about an hour after I sign off, and then you can put it in the comments. That'll be the best thing to do. And you know, what happens is when you put links, YouTube automatically moderates that, and that's my selection because I don't want people to put a lot of junk links onto my channel, but I don't consider that a junk link. It's a useful link, and most of the time I'll give everybody the benefit of the doubt, and so I normally do approve those. But when you put it in, it might appear like YouTube didn't pick it up, but actually it does pick it up, and I look at the comments, and when I find comments with links, I normally do approve them. So within 24 hours, it will be there. And Terrence says, I do not question Kingsley's classical scholarship, but his critiques of contemporaries such as Edinger and James Hillman are based on faulty scholarship. Yeah, he gets over the top, and you know, I've respected James Hillman for a very long time, probably 25 years, since he was doing the men's conferences back in the mid-90s. And as for Edinger, for me, he's almost everything, because he really linked me up with what Dr. Jung was driving at from a religious point of view. And it's so important, because that's what's been causing strife and bloodshed since forever. You know, you may not know about your ancestors in North America, but I certainly know about mine. And, you know, I'm the 13th in a direct line of first sons from a man who came to New Amsterdam in 1625, and he was the Bowery master, which means he was the farmer. He was an indentured farmer who was responsible for literally clearing the land of Bowery number 6. And Bowery number 6 had as its southern border the wall, and on the east side it had the East River. On its north side it had the road that comes off the Brooklyn Bridge. And later in 1630 he went back to Holland and bought his freedom from his indenture. And so the two farms that he then founded appear on the first map of Manhattan Island from 1639. And that's called the Vingboom map. You can find it at the Library of Congress. They sell copies of it. And so his two farms, which he left too early, by the way, were one would be at the foot of the Brooklyn Bridge on the Brooklyn side. And the other one was what is now Kennedy Airport. But his second son was killed by Native Americans in one of the early dust-ups between Europeans and Native Americans. He later went north, and so he's credited with founding 4 New York cities: Brooklyn, Manhattan, Albany, and Rensselaer. And all 4 of those cities have his imprint. And his name was Wilfrid Gerritsen von Kohenhofen. For what it's worth, you can look him up on Wikipedia. I don't remember why I was saying that, but let me think about it. Okay, I remember why I was making this point. So Wolfert and his 3 sons and wife were 5 of the first 150 Europeans to settle Manhattan Island. Now, why would you go across the sea in 1625 in a rickety old boat to start farming in a country you had no idea about? And the reason was because of religious warfare, because of the 80 Years' War. And at that time, the 80 Years' War basically was every year for 80 years, the Spanish came up to Holland every summer and tried to beat the Dutch back into the Catholic Church. And the Dutch every fall would flood their country, and they'd open the dikes and flood their country, and that would cause the Spanish to go home to sunny Spain. And so, that was a hard way to live. And so about halfway through that, the war was ended with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. But so in 1625, after 60 years of that kind of religious warfare, my ancestors said, enough of this, I'm going to the New World. And so this is why I think that Edinger's work and Dr. Jung's work is so important because, you know, I'm literally here and giving you this talk because of the 80 Years' War. And we see it still in our time. And so we have to understand ourselves as human beings much better than we currently do. And so I'm very grateful to Edinger for having connected up the religious meaning of Dr. Jung's work in my psyche, which I didn't have that connection before. And, you know, when I started the reading group, I actually didn't have the religious connection, and I had an unconscious urge to talk about Jung's work. And, you know, I thought I had a good enough reason, but it was only when I discovered Edinger and read his books that I really understood how powerful this is. And so one of the things in that review that was in the New York Times that's interesting is the one individual who was involved in the effort had been a lapsed Jew, and his daughter had asked him a question, you know, what religion are we, Dad? And or what religion are you, Dad? And he said, I'm a Jungian. And that resonates with me, so for what it's worth. And so Jaguar Focus says, good to see me live. Okay, I have to go on with my day, but I'll be back tomorrow probably with a continuation. And the next chapter is called First Day. And this is the chapter where the giant Izdubar appears. And I've done some reading about Izdubar in the past, but Izdubar, the footnote tells us in this chapter that Izdubar was an early name for Gilgamesh, who's the hero in the first written story we have of the hero's journey, which Jordan Peterson loves to talk about. So anyway, so that section of the Red Book begins tomorrow. And I'll talk to you then. Take care now.